All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Sarah Willey. I am here for our Tuesday morning COVID-19 webinar, and we are here specifically to talk about what office settings with in-person work need to do now to prepare for a MIOSHA visit. I'm here with my colleague, Andre. If any of you have been listening to our webinars throughout COVID, I know you know Sandy very, very well. She has become a true resident expert on COVID-19 for sure, and is a faithful webinar presenter. On that note, before I dive in, I need to talk about something important. I was just told this is our 98th COVID-19 webinar. We started, Sandy and I kicked things off back on March 13th. It was Friday the 13th. And I think both Sandy and I thought it was going to be a COVID-19 webinar. Well, 97 later, we are at 98, which of course means tomorrow, Sandy and Rebecca Strauss are presenting on the FFCRA, which will be number 99. Which leads me to this. We need to come up with some sort of fun 100th Miller Johnson COVID-19 webinar. And I just said to Sandy, my brain, unfortunately, right now is full of nothing but COVID-19 information, orders, laws, charts, etc. And I have no creativity left. I'm not even sure I have the ability to have fun anymore. No, that's not true. So all of you, what I need you to do, if you have a good idea for what we should do for our 100th Miller Johnson COVID-19 webinar, please put it in the questions. Something creative, something fun. We could even do just a Q&A, straight up, send us all your questions and we'll answer whatever you want. If you like that idea, let us know. Okay, diving into our subject today, as I said, I'm here with Sandy, and we are here to talk about remote work. Sandy and Rebecca presented a webinar on remote work last week. Well, as COVID goes, things, of course, have changed a bit since last week. And I wanted to also take what they talked about and put it into real practical terms to help you all, employers, workplaces, particularly office settings, prepare for this increased MIOSHA enforcement. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is number one, we're going to review just briefly, again, what the rule is about remote work. I'm going to update you fairly quickly on what's happened since last week. As probably most, if not all of you know, we do have a new emergency order, not from MIOSHA, but from the Michigan Health Department. And then we have some other information from MIOSHA that has come out, a revised FAQ, statements from the director of MIOSHA, Sean Egan, from a Q&A yesterday. Some of you may have attended that as well. And we also have a published, it's called a SEP, S-E-P, which is a publication that MIOSHA puts out to talk about exactly what kind of investigation it's going to have on particular topics. They've published one of those on remote work in office settings too, so we're going to talk about that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about what steps we're recommending you take now so that you've got your ducks in a row in the event that your business is the subject of MIOSHA's increased enforcement on this remote work piece. I am also going to say this, and this is going to color what we talk about today as well. Really, as employers, recognize that we not only have increased MIOSHA enforcement in this area, but talk about remote work and whether or not people should be required to go to work right now is quite active, particularly on social media. So even aside from what MIOSHA says you should or shouldn't do, I'm guessing most of you guys are also hearing from your employees asking whether they're supposed to still come to work. If so, why do I need to be at work, et cetera. If you're not getting those questions yet, I think you probably will. So as part of this process, as we think about compliance, we are also going to be folding into that and understanding that we need to communicate with our employees, and that this is not only a MIOSHA requirement, but probably also an employee relations consideration. All right, so quick review. The standard for remote work, the requirement, is contained in the MIOSHA emergency rule. It's the same rule that's been in place since October 14th, and it's the same standard on paper, right? And it's contained in Rule 5, Section 8, and all it says is the employer shall create a policy prohibiting in-person work for employees to the extent that their work activities can feasibly be completed remotely. So that is the requirement. That's the standard that's been in place since October 14th. It hasn't changed. Okay, and I'm going to talk to you a minute about the order on Sunday, but that hasn't changed, and it's currently on pace to be in effect for 6 months. Okay, that's how long the emergency rules are going to be in place. How that requirement, how that rule is going to be interpreted and has been interpreted and applied has evolved a bit, though. Okay, so let's talk about and let's update you now, starting from Sandy and Rebecca's webinar mid last week. Okay, first of all, on, oh gosh, I think it was Friday, but it might have been Thursday, it's all a blur, MIOSHA updated what it had to say in its FAQs about remote work. It changed it, okay? So in writing, it now says, employer, when it says we have to have a policy, it's now clear it has to be a written policy, and that written policy has to indicate employees are not to perform in-person work if the work activity can feasibly be completed remotely. So it's not a preference, it's not an encouragement, it has to be a prohibition, right? You cannot perform in-person work if your work activity can feasibly be completed remotely. And the burden is on the employer to demonstrate the infeasibility of remote work, okay? And MIOSHA says, what do you need to do in your policy? Well, the policy should include at least which positions or classifications have to work in person and why. Now, I'm going to talk about that more. What MIOSHA really means is, I think, is for positions where that's not obvious, okay? If you're a healthcare organization or manufacturing or retail, it is quite obvious that some of your employees have to work in person. Those providing direct patient care, for example, those running machines, for example, those working on the sales floor, for example, obviously have to be in person. MIOSHA is focused really on employees who come to work in offices when they say this, okay? And then second, for those office positions classifications that have to report for in-person work and why, they're looking for reasons why their work cannot be performed remotely. It has to include enough specificity to show this analysis has been performed. They're looking for a reasoned explanation. They're looking for employers to have the ability to show that they were thoughtful, okay? the written policy can be either standalone or you could put it in the COVID-19 preparedness and response plan. Now, for larger organizations, this idea that you're going to have a list of all positions or classifications or even office jobs that have to come in for in-person work, the idea that you're going to put that in a policy is a bit unwieldy. I think it would also be okay for your policy to explain that this analysis is going to be done and what factors you're going to rely on, and then keep the list separately from the policy. We're going to talk about that more when we get into the enforcement piece. But I just wanted to say that now for those of you who are panicking. Okay, what else has happened? On Sunday, we had a press conference with Governor Whitmer and Joni Calhoun, and also the director of the Michigan Department of Health, and they announced and released a new order published by the Michigan Health Department, not by MIOSHA, but by the Michigan Department of Health. Now, it was interesting because in advance of that press conference and release of the order, there were information had gotten leaked, right? And there was floating around all over the place and speculation as to what was going to be in the order. And ahead of time, it said the new order was going to have a requirement along the lines of everyone's going to have to work from home unless it's impossible to do that. Some of you may have seen that. And then in the press conference, Governor Whitmer seemed to insinuate or say that remote work or work from home was part of the order, part of what they were doing with this revised order. And so when I got my hands on the order, I, of course, expected it to say something about remote work. And it says nothing about remote work at all, which is quite interesting and confusing and confounding and just right along the lines of what we've been living with in the last 8 months, quite frankly. Okay, so the order that came out on Sunday and is going to go into effect tonight at 12:01 doesn't change anything about the requirements in the MIOSHA order for remote work. That is still what we are looking at and abiding by. Okay, so when we talk about remote work, we continue to focus on that standard in the MIOSHA rules and how MIOSHA is interpreting that, okay? I'll say that again. The new Department of Health order does not impact at all the remote work standard. And I'll also mention, because I'm seeing a lot of confusion about this, this also means that the remote work requirements are not in place for 3 weeks, right? That's how long that new Department of Health order is in effect. And the new Department of Health order doesn't say anything about remote work. Our requirement is contained in the MIOSHA emergency rules, which were effective on October 14th and are in place for 6 months. Okay, so don't think that when we're sending folks home to work remotely, that's only going to be for 3 weeks. Okay, the last thing that's happened that you guys need to be aware of is then yesterday, Sean Egan, who's the director of MIOSHA, had a Q&A specifically to talk about remote work, and he did talk a lot about it. And the big picture impact of that is that it's become pretty clear that MIOSHA is pivoting away from its initial view of remote work and intends to apply a much stricter standard. Even though the rule hasn't changed, it does appear that they are viewing the rule now as essentially saying everybody should work from home unless it's impossible to do that. Here are some highlights of what he said in his Q&A. Employers must prohibit in-person work to the maximum extent possible. For anyone who's on the phone and works for a school or a school district, that question was asked, and he was very clear that MIOSHA views schools just like they do any other industry. So if you're wondering whether teachers can be required to come in or be allowed to come in person in order to teach classes remotely, right? That's a common question. The analysis is just the same, right? Do they have to do that? Is it impossible for them to teach their class from home? In some cases, that may very well be the case. There are resources, cameras, and other things that are in the school that teachers need in order to be effective. In other cases, that might not be something that they really need to do in order to effectively perform their job. Okay. What else did Sean say? This was a big one. He was asked the question, can we consider or rely solely on an employee's preference or stated mental health concerns to justify in-person work? In other words, if we have employees saying, I just really need to come into the office because I don't do well when I'm at home all day by myself, he said that is not enough alone to justify in-person work. He didn't say that couldn't be a factor or a consideration at all, but what he said is that would not be enough alone. This was a big one. There was an implied expectation that employers will provide necessary technology. Now, don't panic, because I do want to explain what I mean by that. He was asked the question, how long employers will have to comply with this increased enhancement, okay? And his response was something along the lines of, well, if an employer is showing good faith, we're going to work with you. So, for example, if you have ordered all of the necessary technology you need, laptops and other things, to get your people working remotely, but it hasn't yet arrived, we'll give you some grace and we'll be patient with you, which sounds nice on the surface. However, the implication is that MIOSHA is expecting employers to provide all of that technology. That has not been something that we've understood MIOSHA to be requiring until yesterday when Sean Egan said that, I will be honest. And as you guys know, there are lots and lots of employees who are saying, I don't have good internet, I don't have the equipment, I just can't work from home, I need to come into the office, okay? There's now concern, again, about whether that alone would be enough to justify allowing or requiring an employee to come into an office to work in person. Sean also said employers can't allow in-person work just because employees can distance or have individual offices. Okay, we're getting that question a lot. What does it matter if Sarah comes into work, if she just comes in and sits in her office by herself all day and it doesn't have close contact with anyone? I think that's a valid question, quite frankly. But MIOSHA does not, and his justification was, you need to understand that if somebody's coming and working in an office, it really isn't true that they are never in shared spaces, right? If I come in and work during the day, I'm going to be walking in the hallways and using the restroom, and perhaps I'm going to be in the break room, et cetera. And so they really are looking for people to not be at work if at all possible. Again, he doubled down on this idea that the policy should include a list of positions that require in-person work and why. And most importantly here, MIOSHA's increased enforcement is, their goal seems to be encouraging compliance he said several times they're looking for good faith efforts to comply. They're looking for employers who can demonstrate they were reasoned and thoughtful. And so long as they come into a workplace, and not all office employees are just there because they want to be or because that's what we do, and the employer has been reasoned and thoughtful, MIOSHA might think there are a few or a handful of employees that should instead be working from home, but it didn't sound like they were likely to issue citations for that. Okay? I think the real risk here is not having engaged in the process at all, right? Not having the policy and not having thought about it, I think could result in MIOSHA citations and other concerns. Okay, with that, I'm seeing we've had a couple of questions come in, and so I think I'll take a few of those, and then we will dive into the steps that you all should be taking now to prepare for an investigation. Sandy, do we have any questions, or is it more just excitement over the 100th Miller Johnson COVID-19 webinar?
Well, it's a little bit of both, and as we knew, our clients would come through for us and fill our creative juices gaps. So they've got some great ideas about our webinar, so that's good news. But a few questions here. Yeah, but a few questions here. Can you talk about, or if you want me to talk about, kind of this thought related to critical infrastructure or essential workers, and if you work in an industry or a job that has been previously classified, kind of with that nomenclature, what does that mean for this remote work analysis?
Yes, thank you for saying that, because I thought, for those who attended Sean Egan's Q&A yesterday, he did a fantastic job, but I thought he was a little confusing on that front, quite frankly. And so thank you for asking that. For the purposes of the remote work requirement, critical infrastructure bears zero implications, quite frankly. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're in a critical infrastructure and you have office employees that could work remotely. You are still expected to have your office employees work remotely, even if, for example, you're a hospital. Okay, that is the expectation, period. Sean talked a little bit about essential businesses or critical infrastructure in the context of who has to quarantine after close contact with a person with COVID. And I'm just going to set that aside right now, except to say that's what he was talking about. He wasn't saying any business that is part of the critical infrastructure can mandate or allow everyone to come into work right now, even if they don't need to be there, because that's not the case.
Yep. And so similar to that, additional questions, and maybe I'll just answer it with a comment. We're getting some questions about, well, what about this title in our organization, or this title? And I think he made it clear that no one is exempt from the analysis. Now, certainly there may be justification, right, from your highest paid employee or even your business owner to your lowest paid employee. The analysis needs to happen. Certainly the justifications are different for the position. So you might have, right, more justifications in the on-site work bucket for folks, all throughout that spectrum, but no one is exempt from having the analysis and kind of that thoughtful, reasoned approach applied to them or their position. Seeing several questions about that. The next group of questions, Sarah, is related to kind of this gray space of, okay, what can be the factors? Can performance be a factor? Can efficiency be a factor? At what point is providing all of my employees high-speed internet at home become cost prohibitive, and it falls from the, okay, I don't have to do it kind of bucket. Can you talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so as many of you know, I do a lot of work also with FMLA and ADA, and so I can't help but feel the comparison in this analysis with the reasonable accommodation, interactive process, and undue hardship analysis under the ADA. So if any of you guys are familiar with that, or if that's part of your job responsibilities, this analysis is a lot like that, right? I'm sorry to tell you all, I wish it were the case that we could give you a graph or a mathematical equation and tell you that we know for sure if an employee doesn't have internet plus needs access to some files and does payroll, it's okay for her to work in person every day, right? But not if, right, et cetera. There is a lot of gray. There are very few considerations, though, that are completely off the table. Okay, so that's where I would start. Can a history of poor job performance, particularly in the context of somebody before having attempted to work remotely, like maybe in the spring, can that be a consideration? Sure, I don't see why it can't be a consideration. Okay. Might I be concerned if that's all you have? Well, I'd want to know more about how bad it was, right? Does it meet that standard of it's impossible for that person to do their job remotely? It could, but I'd want to know more. Does it matter if somebody doesn't have internet? Well, that's going to depend a lot on their job and how critical it is for them to be online or on the phone all the time, as well as how hard it's going to be to get it to them. I think you guys get the idea. We're going to be in a lot of gray. There are not certain mathematical equations or anything else. The bottom line is, if you have an office worker and they're going to be required or allowed to work in person, you're going to need to put pen to paper and write down the reasons why. And if that's compelling, if you feel like those reasons are pass the smell test, then you will be able to show MIOSHA that you were reasoned and thoughtful. And maybe MIOSHA will say, we think you got that call wrong, but they're probably not going to cite you for it. I'm not sure, Sandy, whether that answered their questions or not. Probably not, but I think that's likely the best we can do without talking individually to folks and hearing about specific employees and the facts related to those individuals.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Sarah. And so we're seeing a lot of quick questions, what about this? What about this? And so it's the same, all the things that you just said, that probably any of these specific pieces that we're seeing come through the chat, or the Q&A rather, probably if that's your only justification for on-site work, it's probably a little bit tricky. But that, combined with other factors, can be a reasonable argument, and for all the reasons that Sarah just said. So thank you. That was great.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, Sean didn't say anything is off the table, right? He didn't say you're not allowed to consider these things, okay? He wants you to have a thoughtful, reasoned, in good faith analysis.
Exactly. Very good. And just one more before we go ahead and transition, I just want to clean up one thing related to critical infrastructure essential workers. Again, I want to make sure that we're clear. That does not, whether you are, you fell into that category, your industry fell into that category under the initial stay-home orders from the spring, whether you fall into this healthcare provider definition from the FFCRA or emergency responder under FFCRA, that your employer can exclude you from providing those benefits. All of those designations apply to different laws, and they certainly might be one of the reasons that help justify that person being on site, but it is not a free pass, right? You falling into one of those job categories or industry categories under other laws is not a free pass that automatically justifies your on-site work as it relates to the MIOSHA remote work rule.
Exactly, yeah. I think that's exactly right. Obviously, certain industries are doing really critical work, and that can be a consideration as to whether you also need your office folks on site. But that is not going to be an automatic pass on the remote work requirement. Okay, so let's move on to how to prepare for an investigation. These are my practical steps, right, for you all to take. And I'm drawing from the MIOSHA's published SEP on these remote work office investigations, okay? So first of all, just important to understand, MIOSHA also published an interim enforcement guidance back at the beginning, toward the beginning of November, clarifying penalties, et cetera, for violations of its MIOSHA emergency rules related to COVID-19, okay? And if we apply those to this remote work policy requirement, the lack of a policy altogether would likely be cited as a serious violation, which, as you can see, has a fine of about $7 grand or so. It could also be cited under Rule 5.8, which would be less than serious. We think that, so if you have a policy itself, you're step one. You'll not be cited, obviously, for failing to have it if you have it, but then the implementation of it also could result in a fine and be cited as a serious violation too. You need both. Having a policy in writing isn't going to get you there. And then, of course, for willful and repeated violations, we're looking at a $70,000 fine. It's not real clear whether MIOSHA would consider lack of a policy altogether to be a willful violation. I'm guessing at this point they would, because they've been pretty upfront in their expectations and enforcement of that rule. And I think they'd probably find a total lack of implementation to also be a willful violation. But again, that's where we get to the good faith piece, right? If you've got your policy in place and you've engaged in a good faith process to decide who should be in person and who should not be in person, it's unlikely MIOSHA is going to give you a serious citation or say you have a willful violation, even if MIOSHA thinks you got it wrong for a few employees, okay? And Sean Egan said essentially that in his Q&A yesterday, okay? So the SEP I'm talking about says that we MIOSHA are going to target industries that have primarily office workers to enforce this remote work requirement. That means that they're going to have surprise investigations on this issue. And in deciding who to surprise, they've said we're going to be looking at insurance agencies, finance firms, real estate offices, and IT businesses. I have to believe maybe law firms might be on that list too. So Miller Johnson is also working to make sure we're in compliance with this requirement as well. I think that's really, really important for you all to understand. I know some folks on the webinar today fall into those industries. Other folks on the webinar don't fall into those industries. Maybe you're in manufacturing, maybe you're in healthcare, maybe you're in retail, maybe you're in education, et cetera. But you have office workers, of course, as part of your business, okay? For those in the latter category, it's unlikely you're going to get a surprise MIOSHA visit on remote work. However, they will absolutely come and do an investigation if one of your employees calls MIOSHA and makes a complaint, right, or shows concern that the business is just requiring office workers to come into work and is not conducting any sort of analysis. Okay, so if you're in that first category, I would definitely be shoring up in your policy and implementation of the policy, taking these steps we're going to talk about, because you could very well have MIOSHA show up at your door. Otherwise, we'd be looking at likely employee complaints and concerns to trigger the attention of MIOSHA, okay? The SEP says for a remote work investigation, MIOSHA is going to be looking at these things. They've sort of given us the final exam, okay, guys? They're telling us what the questions are going to be on the exam. You're not really going to like it, and it's not going to be I don't know that these items are going to be a surprise to you, but here's what they're going to look at. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to review your COVID-19 preparedness and response plan, okay? They're going to review compliance with the MIOSHA emergency rules. Yeah, and I mean all single-spaced 9 pages of those, okay? They're going to look at whether you're in compliance with other MIOSHA standards that might apply to your business. PPE, sanitation, and recording and reporting obligations for injuries and illnesses, okay? The last one of those apply to all businesses, and I know Sandy's done a webinar on that piece as part of her 3-part MIOSHA series, so look back at that if you're uncertain about what that means. Then MIOSHA is going to look at your remote work policy, right? They're going to make sure you have it, number one, and number two, you've implemented it in good faith. They are 2 more things they're going to look at. They're going to assess whether you have any employees that have been exposed to COVID-19 at work. And here's the last one, they are going to actually interview employees. Okay, now that's going to color some of our recommendations about how to prepare for a MIOSHA investigation. So what do we need to do? Well, step 1, of course, is to create the thoughtful reasoned policy, okay? And again, this can be included, added to your COVID-19 preparedness response plan, or it could be a separate COVID-19 temporary remote work policy. My suggestion is that if you're a business that already has a work from home policy or a remote work policy, my suggestion is that you not necessarily revise that policy to try to address these requirements. And here's why. We're applying just a very different standard in a crazy time, okay? It's a temporary thing we're doing, and it's because of COVID-19. It's not something you want to fold into a policy that is going to last beyond COVID-19, in my opinion. unless you see it, unless you're a business that sees making these changes and having them continue indefinitely. In other words, you're just going to let everybody work remotely because it's going fantastically. But I think if you're in that category, you're probably not on the webinar today, quite frankly. Okay, so I would just create a separate COVID-19 temporary remote work policy, or put it in your preparedness plan. Yes, of course, Miller Johnson has drafted one of those. It is on the Resource Center. In fact, we've revised it again and updated it today, this morning. We put a revised policy up there on the Resource Center. So if any of you are subscribers to the Resource Center, go get it. If you're not, then you need to reach out to me or Sandy or any other lawyer at Miller Johnson you work with, and we can help you with that, okay? The policy needs to, number one, have that statement, right? Show you're telling your employees that they have to work from home if they can feasibly do so, okay? You gotta commit, you gotta at least make a statement in the policy that we are going to assess all positions for which in-person work is not obvious. Again, with that emphasis on office workers, because that's really what MIOSHA is looking at. Identify factors that require in-person work, right? For office workers, here are the reasons you might be required to come in, right? You've got to directly engage with employees, customers. You need access to information that can't leave the plant. You got to do payroll. It's necessary to maintain confidentiality of customer, patient information, et cetera. And then somehow we've got to have that list of office positions for which in-person work is required and why, right? Either have that right in the policy or state that we have the list and then indeed have it. And then also, it's good practice to have your policy reiterate expectations regarding remote work and continued compliance with policies. What I mean is tell employees that while you're working from home, you're still expected to maintain compliance with our attendance policy, keep your time, if you're a non-exempt employee, keep your time accurately, et cetera. If you are a business that already has some remote work agreements, policies, et cetera, you can refer to them in this policy, and reiterate to folks that even those who are working remotely may need to come into the office from time to time to maybe pick up materials or papers or do tasks, et cetera. Reiterate the safety protocols that are in place in the office when they do, right? They're supposed to do the daily health screening, wear a mask, social distance, follow all those protocols when they have to come in. So that's step one, get the policy. Get the policy. At a minimum, you're going to want to do that. And then number two, show your good faith implementation of the policy. If I'm you guys right now, I would start writing down a list of your office workers, right? Their positions. Who are your employees who primarily come to work and work in offices? And then figure out what, if any, job responsibilities they have that must be done in person and why they must be done in person, okay? Now, from a practical standpoint, it's going to be very, very helpful to you in this regard to get input both from the employee and the supervisor. Okay, this is where I compare this process to the undue hardship analysis under the ADA. Right, when we have employees who are requesting accommodations, very often we have leaders, supervisors, managers who say, "Oh, we can't possibly make that we can't accommodate." Right. And so we come back and we say, well, if the standard is undue hardship, help us explain what it is they have to do in their job and why we can't accommodate that. And when we ask them to put pen to paper and give us those reasons, sometimes we find there's wonderful support for that, yes, absolutely, there are very critical things this employee has to do that make that accommodation unreasonable or an undue hardship. And sometimes we find there's nothing, okay? And so think about using using a written assessment form to ask the employee and or the supervisor, what are your job responsibilities that you have to do in person and why? Make them write it down. It will greatly assist your analysis, and it will provide you that written documentation to support your decision. That's also known as covering your butt, right? So you'll have that form in place. We do also have an assessment form like that on the Resource Center. So again, if you're a subscriber, look under remote work. It is up there. If you're not and you're interested, then reach out to one of us in that regard too. We think going through that process, having that form in place, is more than enough to show your good faith, reasoned, and thoughtful implementation of your policy. You're going to satisfy that requirement for MIOSHA. Now, again, MIOSHA may say, oh, I don't know that we agree with your conclusions for Sandy, for example, but we're not going to cite you for it. We're not going to find you engaged in a willful violation of the rules because we can see you implemented that policy and you were thoughtful in your approach. Okay, step 3, and this goes to the employee relations aspect of this. Okay, step 3, and it's very important. It also goes to the idea that MIOSHA is going to interview your folks who are working in person. Okay, you've got to communicate after you implement your policy and you reach a conclusion. Communicate that in some way in writing to your office workers. Okay, either telling them that you believe that it's feasible for them to work remotely on a temporary basis, or you believe it is not feasible, and so they're going to be required or allowed to work in person. If it's the latter, I highly, highly recommend you tell them why, okay? And that is because if MIOSHA shows up, MIOSHA is going to interview that person and ask them that question. They're going to say, Sarah, you're at work today. Well, why is it not feasible for you to work remotely? Okay. Well, if Miller Johnson has engaged in communication with me in that regard, we're going to be on the same page, okay? And we're going to be saying the same thing. What you don't want is for Sarah to say, I don't know, Miller Johnson just sent me an email saying I had to be here. I don't know why they think that I have to be at work in person, quite frankly. That will also help head off employee complaints to MIOSHA, saying that for employees who say that they're being required to work in person and there's no reason for it. It won't perfectly head off complaints, but it will help accomplish that. Which leads us to step 4. If you have employees who, notwithstanding that process, right, meaning we have a policy, we went through the implementation of the policy, we communicated back to employees who had to come in. If you still have employees who are saying, I don't think I need to do my job in person, I would listen to what they have to say and make sure you got it right, okay, in a meaningful way, because they might be right. Okay, a lot of this is gray area, okay? I would listen to them with the understanding that there's a 50-50 chance, if not greater, that they're probably going to call MIOSHA if they don't feel like you're listening. They're gonna try to get somebody else to listen to what they have to say. And I would double down then and make sure that you're comfortable with your analysis and you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's. And if we're going to dig in our heels, I think that's fine, but let's make sure that we are right about it. And then I would communicate with that employee again in writing about the conclusions, okay? And then the last step, if you can get through all that process and finish the remote work piece, of course, then it's also, we also have to recognize that if you have a MIOSHA investigation on remote work, remember they're going to be looking at other things too, okay? And so I have to say, you got to also review your plans and compliance if we're going to prepare for a MIOSHA visit on remote work, which includes review your preparedness and response plan. If that hasn't been updated since March or April when you first implemented it, you need to update that plan, I promise you. We've got updated plans on our resource center. For those who aren't familiar with the resource center is a subscription-based service, and essentially what we do is provide businesses with all the written materials they need to be in compliance with the myriad of, it used to be executive rules, now it's DHHS, MIOSHA orders, and Public Act 238, and the FFCRA and everything else. But we constantly update it so that as our landscape changes from hour to hour and day to day and week to week, the materials all stay in compliance, okay? We created the Resource Center because we quickly found out in COVID that there was way too much information to get out to way too many businesses, and it was the most efficient way for us to do that. So if you're a subscriber, go on there. If not, let us know. If you're interested in looking at the Resource Center, I can also give folks temporary access so that you can take a look and see what's in there and see if you want to subscribe, by the way. Okay, what else? You got to review your workplace compliance with the MIOSHA emergency rules. We've now, Sandy and I, Sandy even more than me actually, has lived through several MIOSHA investigations for all different businesses and industries. And the list on this slide is really across the board what they look at, what they spend the most time looking at, right? So they're gonna look at your preparedness plan, obviously. They're gonna make sure you have that on-site COVID-19 supervisor. Lots of businesses are missing that one, guys. You're supposed to have a COVID-19 supervisor who's on site at all times. It does not have to be the same person, obviously. If you're a 24/7 operation, people can sleep. They're going to make sure folks are wearing masks. They're going to make sure you're doing the daily health screenings and keeping the documentation. They're going to make sure you have a positive test protocol and the documentation to support you provided the necessary notices when an employee tests positive. They're going to make sure you've got something prohibiting employees with symptoms from working, and they're going to make sure you did the required employee training and documented it. And then finally, again, if you are an industry that is subject to the PPP or sanitation standards, they're going to look at that. And then if you've had an employee or employees who have been exposed to COVID-19 in the workplace, there are recording and reporting obligations, and they're going to make sure you complied with those. Okay, so those are the general compliance standards. All right, Sandy, we have a few minutes. Are there some questions that are standing out to you that we can answer at this point?
Sure. I actually see a couple of themes here, and so maybe we can try to address those generally. The first one I see lots of really good questions about, well, what about if I have some employees, you know, they have some duties that need to happen on site, so can I have them come in 1 or 2 days a week and remote the rest of the time? yeah, don't think of this requirement as kind of an all or nothing approach. And in fact, I think you would get further from MIOSHA and more grace for them to say, you've really taken that thoughtful, reasoned approach, and you haven't drawn broad strokes in that line to say there are some things that need to happen on site, but we're not using that as the golden ticket to have Sandy here all the time, 40 hours a week. So you'll do the same analysis, but if there are truly things that have to happen on site, making it full or part-time, that's perfectly appropriate. Just wanting to touch base, a couple of questions related to face-to-face meetings with clients. So we have some employers whose jobs require them to meet, have in-person client interactions, and wanting to know if this rule prohibits that. And so just to button that up a little bit, this rule does not prohibit face-to-face meetings. And in fact, unless you fall into one of those kind of prohibited gatherings under the MDHHS order, that's not generally an expectation. So if your job requires face-to-face interaction with your clients, and that's something that has to happen on site, that's fine. This is not a prohibition against that. Several additional questions related to performance, right? So what if my employee is not a good employer? How do I manage performance and all of those pieces? And so I'll just kind of direct back to what Sarah said a little bit earlier. Performance can certainly be a factor, but that can't be the only factor informing this analysis. And so you'll want to go through the whole that whole analysis. A couple of questions related to whether the MIOSHA rule is going to change. And golly, guys, almost 100 webinars in, I'm not sure. I think it's less likely to change and to go through iterations like the executive orders did. Passing an emergency rule is a little bit more involved, quite frankly. And so I think we'll see interpretations of the rule maybe wax and wane, and we've seen that just in the last week. So I don't know that it won't, but the structure is a little bit different. And then the last piece here, again, related to high-level executives or owners or things like that. Remember, there's no per se exclusion from any type of industry or employer or employee that you don't need to go through this analysis related to remote work. So we would just encourage you to take a broad approach to kind of throw everybody's job into that basket. Certainly the analysis might be quicker for some employees or jobs than others, but we need to be doing that analysis on everyone. And those are the general themes that I see.
Yeah, and just one thing to make clear, I completely agree with you that I don't think MIOSHA is going to keep changing the rules in the way that we saw executive orders or even the MDHHS update their order. However, they are going to change how they enforce them and how they interpret them. And this is a fantastic example, okay? So I see a couple of questions saying, well, wait a minute, I'm confused. Last week, it sounded like MIOSHA was just going to defer to the employer's judgment and not really second guess anything. Yeah, that's what they said last week, right? That is not what Sean Egan said yesterday, however. What that is MIOSHA not changing the rule, but publicly telling you that it's changing how they are going to interpret and apply the rule. Okay, so that's correct. Last week, it looked like MIOSHA was going to largely defer to employers. This week, however, it looks like MIOSHA is going to be more inclined to second guess employers. However, and I can't emphasize this enough, don't panic. It still is the case that they're in order to avoid violations and citations, they are still primarily just looking to make sure you were reasoned and thoughtful, okay? But what Sean Egan said is, we may disagree with your conclusions, okay, but we're going to, in his words, quote unquote, work with you on that. What he was saying is, we might tell you that you got it wrong and employees have to go home, but if you were reasoned and thoughtful, we're probably not going to cite you for violations. Okay, and I'm going to leave it there because I hope that maybe makes people feel a little bit better. I'm not sure. So, just one question. I see folks asking about getting access to the policy or other standalone documents. Shoot an email to me or Sandy after this, and we can talk about that option if you're not interested in subscribing to the Resource Center. Okay.
One more quick thing, and then we can wrap up because I see it's 9 o'clock. But several questions just came in regarding the COVID-19 safety coordinator. And remember, this person has to be on site anytime that there are employees on site. So if you've designated somebody as your coordinator whose job can be done remotely, a couple of options. If you have no other employees on site, that's fine. The person doesn't need to be there. But to the extent that you have employees who are working on site, somebody needs to kind of be wearing that title. And remember, the COVID-19 safety coordinator doesn't need to be just one person. So if you've determined, 5 people need to be on site, you can deem one of those persons the safety coordinator for the day or for the shift or for the duration. So that's kind of a moving, malleable, flexible piece as well. But
thank you, Sandy.
Yep. Thanks, Sarah.
All right. Thanks, guys. Everyone have a fantastic day. We look for an announcement of the 100th webinar. We've gotten a ton of fun ideas, so I'm now excited about this. This is going to be great. All right. We'll talk soon. Thanks, guys. Bye.